Hello, Guy. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to a valley nestled between harsh, unforgiving mountains in the southern heart of ancient Greece. We are going to a place whose name has become a byword for discipline, for toughness, for a life stripped of all comfort and dedicated to a single brutal purpose. We are going to Sparta. The image of the Spartan warrior is an icon of history. The red cloak, the bronze helmet, the unbreakable shield wall. We think of the 300 at Thermopylae, a legend of heroic sacrifice against impossible odds. But behind this legend lies a darker and far more complex reality. The life of a Spartan was not a life of heroic choices, but of absolute cradle-to-grave submission to the state. It was a life built upon a foundation of terror, a society deliberately engineered to be a military camp, where every citizen was a soldier and every aspect of life, from birth to death, from marriage to meals, was ruthlessly controlled. To understand the Spartan warrior, we must look beyond the battlefield. We must enter the brutal barracks of their childhood, stand in the common mess hall where their loyalty was tested daily, and understand the ever-present fear that was the true heart of their civilization. This is the story of the Spartan Way, a journey into the daily life of the most formidable and terrifying social experiment in the ancient world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand Sparta, one must first understand the Helots. It is impossible to comprehend the brutal logic of the Agoge, the strange nature of Spartan marriage, the communal mess halls, or the all-consuming militarism of their state without first grasping the central, terrifying fact upon which their entire civilization was built. The Spartans were not a nation of soldiers by choice. They were a nation of soldiers by necessity. They were a small, ruling minority, a permanent army of occupation living in their own country, and they were surrounded, outnumbered, and perpetually terrified by a vast enslaved population who hated them with a bitter and justifiable passion. These were the Helots, and the constant, simmering threat of a Helot uprising was the central organizing principle of all Spartan life. The Spartan way was not born from a philosophical ideal of courage. It was born from a foundation of fear. Who were the Helots? They were not slaves in the sense that one might find in Athens or Rome, where slaves were typically foreign captives, bought and sold as individuals. The Helots were a collective, a people. They were the original Greek inhabitants of the fertile lands of Laconia, the region around Sparta, and, more importantly, of Messenia, the large, rich plain to the west of Sparta's formidable Taygetus mountain range. In the early Archaic period, around the 8th century BCE, the Spartans, facing population pressure and a shortage of good land, did something unique in the Greek world. Instead of sending out colonies like other city-states, they turned inwards and conquered their neighbors. They waged a long and brutal war against the Messenians, and after decades of fighting, they were victorious. But they did not simply make Messenia a subject ally. They did something far more drastic. They enslaved the entire population. The Helots were tied to the land they worked, the kleroi, the agricultural plots that were owned by the Spartan citizens. They were not chattel slaves who could be bought and sold on the open market, but were state property assigned to a particular plot of land and the Spartan family that owned it. They could not be sold away from their land, and they were allowed to have their own families and communities. In this sense, they were more like medieval serfs, but their condition was far worse. They were forced to work the land and give a massive portion of their produce, a full 50%, according to some sources, to their Spartan masters. This agricultural surplus was what freed the Spartan citizen from the need to perform any form of manual labor. It was the Helots who farmed the fields, tended the livestock, and produced the food that allowed every Spartan male to dedicate his entire life, from the age of 7, to the single, all-consuming profession of being a soldier. The Spartan military machine was built entirely on the bent backs of Helot labor. The demographic imbalance between the Spartans and the Helots was the source of their constant gnawing fear. While precise numbers are impossible to come by, ancient historians like Herodotus and Thucydides suggest that the Helots outnumbered the Spartan citizens by a staggering margin, perhaps 7 or 8 to 1. This meant that the small ruling class of Spartiates was a tiny island of masters in a vast sea of resentful subjects. The Spartans lived in a permanent state of undeclared internal war. The Greek writer Xenophon, who admired many aspects of Sparta, noted that the Spartans always carried their spears with them, even in the city, so they would never be caught unarmed by a potential Helot attack. This ever-present danger shaped every aspect of their society. The Agoge, the brutal state-run education system, was not designed simply to create brave soldiers, but to create a class of ruthless and unquestioningly obedient enforcers, a human weapon perfectly forged for the task of intimidating and controlling the Helot population. The emphasis on communal living in the barracks and the mandatory dining in the Syssition was a way of fostering an intense and unbreakable bond among the Spartan peers, ensuring their absolute solidarity in the face of the internal enemy. Even the famous laconic brevity, the Spartan habit of using as few words as possible, can be seen as a form of military discipline, a way of maintaining a constant state of alertness and seriousness, with no time for frivolous chatter. The Spartan state was, in effect, a highly developed system of institutionalized terror designed to keep the Helots in a state of perpetual fear and submission. The most infamous and terrifying of these institutions was the Cryptia. The name itself is chilling, meaning the secret thing or the secret service. The Cryptia was a select group of the most promising young Spartans from the Agoge. They were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a knife and the barest of rations. They were instructed to hide during the day and to travel by night, living off the land and spying on the Helot population. Their ultimate mission, according to the historian Plutarch, was to murder any Helot they found out at night, particularly targeting the strongest and most charismatic individuals who might have the potential to lead a rebellion. The Cryptia was a state-sponsored death squad, its purpose to terrorize the Helots through a campaign of random, unpredictable assassinations, a constant and brutal reminder of the consequences of resistance. The declaration of war on the Helots was not a metaphor. It was an annual formal ritual. Each year, the newly elected officials, the ephors, would ritually declare war on the Helot population. This was a grim piece of legal and religious maneuvering. By being in a formal state of war, any Spartan could kill a Helot at any time without incurring the religious pollution and the legal consequences that would normally be associated with murder. It was a state-sanctioned, permanent open season. On the people who fed them, the Spartans also used other forms of psychological warfare to humiliate and degrade the Helots. They would force them to drink unmixed wine, something a civilized Greek would never do, and then bring them into their common mess halls to show the young Spartan boys the degrading effects of drunkenness. They would force them to wear ridiculous animal skin caps and to sing demeaning songs, constantly reinforcing their subhuman status. Despite these brutal measures, the fear of a Helot uprising was never far from the surface, and on several occasions that fear became a reality. The greatest crisis came in 464 BCE, when a massive earthquake devastated Sparta, killing thousands of people and destroying much of the city. The Helots, seeing their masters weakened and in disarray, seized the opportunity and rose in a massive coordinated rebellion. This was the Third Messenian War, a long and brutal conflict that lasted for nearly a decade. The Spartans were pushed to the very brink of destruction. They were forced to call for help from their allies, including Athens, to put down the rebellion. The experience of this war, a desperate struggle for their very survival in their own homeland, left a deep and permanent scar on the Spartan psyche. It reinforced their paranoia and their conviction that only through the most rigid discipline and the most brutal repression could their state survive. The great Athenian historian Thucydides provides a chilling account of one particularly notorious incident that reveals the depth of Spartan paranoia. Fearing the number of Helots who had fought alongside them and had shown bravery, the Spartan authorities announced that any Helot who felt he had served Sparta well should come forward to be rewarded with his freedom. About 2,000 of the bravest Helots came forward. They were crowned with garlands and led in a procession around the temples, a public ceremony to celebrate their emancipation. And then, Thucydides tells us, they disappeared. No one ever knew how each one of them was destroyed. The Spartans had used the promise of freedom as a way to identify and eliminate the most dangerous and capable of the Helots. The entire Spartan system, therefore, can be seen as a response to a single fundamental problem. How can a small elite group maintain permanent control over a large, hostile, and geographically rooted population? Their solution was to turn their entire society into a perfectly honed instrument of repression. They sacrificed art, philosophy, literature, economic freedom, and even the comforts of family life, all for the sake of maintaining their brutal and precarious dominion. The foundation of the Spartan state was not the virtues of courage and discipline, but the vices of fear and oppression. The Helots were the secret that explained everything, the silent, toiling majority whose labor and whose suffering made the Spartan way of life possible, and whose very existence made it an absolute necessity. The life of a Spartan warrior began not on the battlefield, but in the first moments after his birth. The process of forging this human weapon was the primary and all-consuming focus of the Spartan state, and it began with a brutal act of selection. According to the historian Plutarch, When a male child was born in Sparta, he was not left to the care of his parents. The father would take the newborn infant to a place called the leash, a meeting hall, where the elders of his tribe would officially inspect him. They would examine the baby for any signs of physical deformity or weakness. If the child was deemed healthy and well-formed, he was given back to his parents to be raised. But if he was found to be ill-born or deformed, he was taken away and left to die of exposure in a deep chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, a place known as the Apothetae, or the Deposits. This was not seen as an act of cruelty, but as a pragmatic decision for the good of the state. A Spartan's life was to be one of service to the city, and a child who was not physically perfect was considered to be a useless burden, not worth the cost of his upbringing. While modern archaeology has not found a mass grave of infant bones at the site, which suggests this practice may have been exaggerated or was less common than Plutarch implies, the story itself reveals the core principle of Spartan society. The individual had no intrinsic worth. His only value was his potential usefulness to the state. A Spartan did not belong to his family, he belonged to Sparta. If the infant was deemed fit to live, he was returned to his parents for the first 7 years of his life. But this early upbringing was also governed by the strict Spartan ethos. Spartan nurses were famous throughout the Greek world for their harsh and effective methods. They were taught to raise children with a Spartan lack of fuss. Infants were not coddled or swaddled tightly, which was believed to make them stronger and more independent. They were taught not to be afraid of the dark, not to be picky eaters, and not to cry or throw tantrums. This early period of toughening and discipline was the prelude to the all-encompassing system that would define the rest of his youth. At the age of 7, the young Spartan boy's life was irrevocably changed. He was taken from his family and his home, and he was enrolled in the Agoge, the state-run military education system. For the next 13 years he would live, train, and sleep in a communal barracks with the other boys of his age group. The Agoge was a brutal and relentless system, a social and psychological pressure cooker designed to strip the boy of his individual identity and to forge him into a perfect cog in the Spartan military machine. The goal was not to produce a well-rounded individual, but to produce a warrior who was physically tough, unquestioningly obedient, and fanatically loyal to his comrades and the state. The boys in the Agoge were organized into packs, or agili, under the command of an older boy, an iron, a youth of about 19, who had already completed his own training. The iron had the authority to command the younger boys and to punish them severely for any infraction. The entire system was overseen by a state official called the paedonomos, or boy herder, who was a respected nobleman, often a veteran of many battles. The education provided by the Agoge was overwhelmingly physical. The boys spent their days in relentless training, running, jumping, wrestling, and throwing the javelin and the discus. They were taught to endure pain without complaint, to march in silence, and to obey any order instantly and without question. One of the most famous and most brutal aspects of the Agoge was the deliberate and systematic underfeeding of the boys. They were given the bare minimum of rations, just enough to survive, and were kept in a constant state of hunger. This was done for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was believed that it would make them taller and leaner, better suited for the life of a soldier. Secondly, and more importantly, it was designed to encourage them to steal. Stealing was not considered a crime in Sparta, but a vital part of a young boy's training. It taught him stealth, cunning, and resourcefulness, all essential skills for a soldier on campaign. However, there was a crucial catch. If a boy was caught stealing, he was punished severely, not for the act of theft itself, but for the clumsiness of getting caught. The historian Xenophon tells a famous story of a boy who had stolen a live fox and hidden it under his cloak. To avoid being discovered, he allowed the fox to claw at his stomach, disemboweling him, and he died without ever crying out in pain. A perfect, if horrifying, example of the Spartan ideal of endurance. Discipline in the Agoge was maintained through constant and often brutal physical punishment. The boys were regularly whipped for any sign of weakness, disobedience, or failure. This culminated in an annual ritual held at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, a particularly ancient and fearsome aspect of the goddess. As a rite of passage, the boys were forced to run to the altar and attempt to steal cheeses that had been placed upon it, while being flogged with whips by the priests. The contest was a test of both courage and endurance. The boy who could endure the whipping the longest without crying out was hailed as the winner. Plutarch notes that he had seen many boys die under the lash at this very altar, their deaths. Seen as a glorious sacrifice, the boys' physical hardship was relentless. They were forced to sleep on hard beds made of reeds that they had to break off with their own hands from the banks of the Eurotas River. They were given only one cloak to wear for the entire year for both summer and winter, and they were expected to go barefoot at all times to harden their feet for a life of marching. Their intellectual education was minimal and strictly practical. They were taught to read and write, but only as much as was necessary. The main focus of their academic training was on memorizing the laws of Sparta and the war songs that would inspire them in battle. They were also taught a particular style of speech, the Laconic style, named for their homeland of Laconia. They were trained to be concise, to say what they meant in as few words as possible, and to have a sharp, cutting wit. Frivolous or long-winded talk was seen as a sign of weakness and indiscipline. The social dynamics within the barracks were intense. The boys were encouraged to form close, competitive bonds with their peers. Homosexual relationships between the older Irons and the younger boys were a common and institutionalized part of the Agoge. These relationships were not seen in the same way as in modern culture, but were a part of the educational system. The older mentor was supposed to be a role model for the younger boy, teaching him the virtues of courage and honor, and the intense bond between them was seen as a way of strengthening the fighting spirit of the phalanx. Upon reaching the age of 20, the young Spartan graduated from the Agoge. He was now a full-time soldier, but his training and his life of communal service were far from over. He was still not a full citizen. To achieve that final, crucial step, he had to be elected into a Syssition, or common dining mess, a subject we will explore next. The Agoge was a 13-year ordeal that systematically broke a boy down, stripping him of his family ties and his individual desires, and then rebuilt him as a perfect instrument of the state. It was a terrifyingly effective system of indoctrination. one that created the most disciplined and feared soldiers in the ancient world, but at the cost of their own humanity. At the age of 20, having survived the 13 years of brutal and dehumanizing training in the Agoge, the young Spartan male reached a critical turning point in his life. He was now a soldier, a warrior, but he was not yet a full citizen. He had graduated from the barracks of his boyhood, but before he could be considered a true Spartan, an equal or a homoios, he had to pass one final, crucial social test. He had to be unanimously elected into a Syssition, one of the common dining messes that were the fundamental building blocks of Spartan society. The Syssition, which literally means eating together, was far more than just a military canteen. It was an exclusive private club, a sacred brotherhood, and the primary institution that bound the Spartan elite together. Membership was mandatory for citizenship, and failure to be elected or to maintain one's membership was a social catastrophe, a sentence of civil death that would strip a man of his honor and his rights. The daily ritual of the common meal was the ultimate expression of the Spartan ideal of absolute equality and unbreakable solidarity. The Syssition, also known as the Fedician, was a small group, a dining club of about 15 men. These men were comrades in arms. They would live together, train together, and most importantly, fight alongside each other in the phalanx. The bonds forged in the mess hall were the bonds that would hold the shield wall together in the terror of battle. To be accepted into one of these groups, a young Spartan graduate of the Agoge had to be nominated by an existing member. His candidacy would then be put to a secret vote of the entire mess. Each member would take a piece of bread, and as they passed a bowl, they would cast their vote. To vote in favor, they would simply drop the bread into the bowl. To vote against, they would squeeze the bread flat in their hand before dropping it in. The vote had to be unanimous. A single flattened piece of bread, a single black ball, was enough to deny a man membership. This was a test not of a man's fighting ability, which had already been proven in the Agoge, but of his character and his social compatibility. The other members had to be sure that he was a man they could trust, a man whose discipline, whose temperament, and whose loyalty were beyond question. Was he good company? Was his wit sharp but not insulting? Was he discreet and able to keep the secrets of the mess? A young man who was seen as arrogant, or sullen, or cowardly would be rejected. This process ensured that every Spartan citizen was not only a skilled warrior, but also a man who had been vetted and approved by his peers. A man who failed to be elected was cast into a state of social disgrace. He would become an outcast, a man without a mess, without honor, and without the rights of citizenship. He would eat alone for the rest of his life, a pariah in a society that valued the collective above all else. The pressure on a young man during this election process must have been immense. Once a man was accepted into a Syssition, he was a member. For life, he was required to eat his evening meal there every single day. No excuse other than being away on a military campaign or performing a religious sacrifice was considered valid. Even the kings were not exempt from this duty. This daily ritual was a powerful tool of social control and indoctrination. It constantly reinforced the bonds of the brotherhood and ensured that no man could become too attached to the private comforts of his own home or family. The Syssition was a man's true family. His wife and children were a secondary concern. The men would recline on hard wooden benches. Their conversation focused on matters of war, politics, and the education of the young. The older, veteran members would use the mealtime as an opportunity to question the younger members, to test their wit and their knowledge of Spartan law, continuing the educational process of the Agoge in a more informal setting. The food served at the Syssition was, in true Spartan fashion, simple, plain, and barely adequate. The most famous and most notorious dish was the malas zomos, or black broth. The exact recipe is lost, but it was said to have been made from boiled pig's blood, pork, salt, and vinegar. It was, by all accounts, a disgusting concoction. A famous story tells of a visitor from the luxurious city of Sybaris who, after tasting the broth, declared that he now understood why the Spartans were so willing to die in battle, as death was preferable to eating such food. The black broth, along with a simple barley bread, a small amount of cheese, and some figs, was the staple of their diet. This meager and unappetizing fare was a deliberate choice, designed to promote discipline and to reject the luxury and decadence that the Spartans saw as the cause of weakness in other Greek states. Crucially, this food was not provided by the state. Each member of the Syssition was required to contribute a fixed monthly quota of provisions from his own personal estate, his kleros. This typically consisted of a set amount of barley, wine, cheese, and figs, as well as a small amount of money. To buy meat, this system had a profound social consequence. A Spartan citizenship was not just dependent on his birth and his military training. It was dependent on his continued ability to pay his dues. His kleros, the plot of land he had been granted by the state, was worked by Helots, who were required to give him half of their produce. If, for some reason, a bad harvest, poor management, or the division of the estate among too many sons, a Spartan's kleros could no longer produce enough to meet his monthly contribution, he would be expelled from his mess. And with that expulsion, he would be stripped of his citizenship and his honor. He would be demoted to a lower class of inferiors, known as hypomanes. This economic requirement was a powerful and ruthless mechanism for maintaining the quality and the exclusivity of the citizen body. Over the centuries, as the number of kleroi shrank due to inheritance and the concentration of land in the hands of a few wealthy families, this system would lead to a catastrophic decline in the number of Spartan citizens, a fatal weakness that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The Syssition was the great equalizer of Spartan society. Within its walls, all members were theoretically equal. The rich and the poor, by Spartan standards, ate the same simple food, sat on the same hard benches, and were subject to the same strict rules of discipline. The kings themselves would dine with their messmates, their only privilege being a double portion of food, which they would often share with a guest or a particularly deserving warrior. This enforced equality was designed to prevent the rise of factions and the kind of class-based conflict that was so common in other Greek cities. The Syssition was the ultimate expression of the Spartan ideal of the homoia, the similars or peers. The mass was a place of secrets, a closed society within a closed society. The conversations that took place within its walls were not to be repeated outside. It was here that political opinions were formed, military strategies were debated, and the reputations of men were made or broken. It was the social, political, and military heart of the Spartan state. A man's life was defined by his mess. It was his band of brothers, his source of honor, and the guarantor of his status. To fail the Syssition was to fail as a Spartan. This daily ritual of the common meal, with its disgusting black broth and its rigid rules, was the blood oath that bound the Spartan elite together, a constant reaffirmation of their shared identity and their collective, iron-willed determination to remain the masters of their Helot-filled land. In the stark and masculine world of ancient Sparta, a world that seems to be defined entirely by the barracks and the battlefield, the role of women was both unique and profoundly important. The Spartan woman was unlike any other woman in ancient Greece. While the women of democratic Athens were largely confined to the seclusion of their homes, with no formal education and no role in public life, the women of Sparta were educated, athletic, and enjoyed a level of freedom and influence that shocked and often scandalized their Greek contemporaries. This was not the result of an early form of feminism or a belief in gender equality. It was a product of the same ruthless and pragmatic logic that shaped every other aspect of Spartan society. The Spartan state recognized a simple biological reality. Strong, healthy women produce strong, healthy children. And in a state obsessed with producing the best soldiers in the world, the production of healthy male infants was a woman's primary and most sacred duty to the state. The Spartan woman was not seen as a warrior herself, but as the mother of warriors, and it was in this crucial role that she found her power, her purpose, and her formidable reputation. The education of Spartan girls was as radical and as state-controlled as that of the boys. While they did not enter the formal Agoge or live in barracks, they were not left to a purely domestic education at home. From a young age, girls were enrolled in a state-supervised educational program that was, in many ways, the female equivalent of the boys' training. The focus of their education was overwhelmingly physical. They were taught to run, to wrestle, to throw the discus and the javelin. They would participate in athletic competitions, often exercising naked alongside the boys, a practice that was a source of endless fascination and shock to other Greeks. The purpose of this intense physical training, as explained by writers like Xenophon and Plutarch, was eugenic. The Spartans believed that for a woman to produce strong, healthy offspring, she herself had to be strong and healthy. Her physical excellence was a prerequisite for the military excellence of her future sons. Beyond the physical, Spartan girls also received a formal education. They were taught to read and write, and they had their own rich tradition of choral music and dance. The great choral lyrics of poets like Alcman were written to be performed by choirs of young Spartan women at religious festivals. These songs were a form of moral and cultural education, instilling in the girls the values of piety, community, and devotion to the state. The goal of this education was to produce a woman who was not just physically fit, but also intelligent, disciplined, and possessed of a powerful sense of civic duty. As a result of this upbringing, Spartan women enjoyed a level of freedom and autonomy that was unparalleled in the Greek world. With their husbands living in the barracks until the age of 30 and dedicated to a life of military service thereafter, The women were left in complete control of the household and the family. Estate, the kleros. They were the de facto managers of the agricultural land and the masters of the Helot population that worked it. This gave them immense economic power. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, a harsh critic of Sparta, noted with disapproval that in his time women owned and controlled nearly 2/5 of all the land and wealth in Sparta. They were literate, they were numerate, and they were actively engaged in the economic life of the state. They also had a public voice and a reputation for being assertive and outspoken. The famous laconic wit was not just a male preserve. Stories of the sharp and often biting remarks of Spartan women were legendary. One famous tale tells of a foreign woman who said to Gorgo, the wife of King Leonidas, "You Spartan women are the only women in the world who can rule men." To which Gorgo replied, "That is because we are the only women who give birth to men." This famous retort perfectly encapsulates the Spartan woman's sense of her own importance and her role in the state. She was a mother of men, and that was the source of her power and her pride. The primary duty of a Spartan woman, the very reason for her existence in the eyes of the state, was to get married and produce healthy male children. Marriage in Sparta was a strange and ritualized affair, far removed from the romantic or companionate ideals of other cultures. It was a state duty, and men who did not marry were publicly shamed. When a young woman reached the age of about 18 or 20, a suitable husband would be chosen for her. The marriage ceremony itself was a form of ritualized abduction. The bride would have her head shaved. She would be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, and she would be left alone in a dark room. The groom would then sneak away from his barracks at night, capture his bride in the darkness, and consummate the marriage. He would then immediately return to the barracks to sleep with his messmates. This strange ritual was likely a symbolic holdover from an earlier era, but it also served to emphasize the non-domestic nature of Spartan marriage. For the first several years of their marriage, the husband would continue to live in the barracks, only visiting his wife in secret at night. The goal was procreation, the production of children for the state, not the creation of a loving domestic household. A woman's status in society was directly linked to her success as a mother. To bear a son who would grow up to be a brave warrior was the greatest honor a Spartan woman could achieve. To be childless was a source of great shame. The state's obsession with eugenics extended even to the private lives of its citizens. According to some ancient sources, if a man's wife was barren, he could be encouraged to allow another, more fertile man to impregnate her, so that her lineage could continue and the state would not be deprived of potential soldiers. The children belonged to Sparta, and the biological parentage was a secondary concern. This intense focus on their role as mothers of warriors is most famously captured in the collection of sayings attributed to Spartan women. A mother handing her son his shield as he went off to war would not wish him a safe return. Instead, she would give him the famous and chilling command, "E tan e epitas," which means either with this or on this. Come back either carrying your shield in victory or being carried upon it, dead. To drop the heavy shield was the ultimate act of cowardice, as it broke the integrity of the phalanx and endangered one's comrades. A glorious death in battle was infinitely preferable to a dishonorable life. Plutarch tells the story of a Spartan mother who, upon hearing that her son had been killed in battle, simply said, "This is what I bore him for, so that he might be one who would not hesitate to die for his country." This seemingly cold and unnatural attitude was the ultimate expression of a woman's patriotic duty. Her personal feelings of love and grief were to be completely subordinated to the glory and the welfare of the state. Spartan women were not warriors, but they were essential to the functioning of the Spartan war machine. They were the mothers who produced the soldiers, the educators who instilled the core values of Spartan discipline in their young children, and the managers who ran the estates that fed the army. They were strong, independent, and powerful figures who, in their own unique way, were as dedicated to the ideals of the Spartan state as their husbands and sons were on the battlefield. Their lives, like those of the men, were a testament to a society that had completely subjugated the individual to the perceived needs of the collective. The final product of the brutal Agoge, the intense social pressure of the Syssition, and the eugenic ideals of Spartan motherhood was the Spartan Hoplite. He was the most feared and respected infantry soldier of the ancient Greek world, a living weapon who represented the culmination of his society's all-consuming obsession with military perfection. The Spartan warrior was not just an individual soldier. He was a component, a perfectly machined part in a larger, terrifyingly efficient killing machine, the phalanx. His equipment, his appearance, and his mindset were all carefully designed to serve this collective purpose. To look upon a Spartan hoplite, with his iconic red cloak, his long flowing hair, and the stark lambda on his shield, was to look upon the very embodiment of the Spartan state, a symbol of its discipline, its uniformity, and its deadly power. The appearance of the Spartan hoplite was deliberately intimidating and instantly recognizable. One of their most distinctive features was their long hair. While most other Greek soldiers cut their hair short for practicality, the Spartans wore their hair long and would take great care to wash and comb it before a battle. The historian Herodotus tells the famous story of a Persian spy who, on the eve of the Battle of Thermopylae, observed the small Spartan force in their camp. He was shocked to see them not sharpening their swords or preparing for battle, but calmly exercising and meticulously combing their long, flowing hair. When he reported this seemingly frivolous activity back to the Persian king, Xerxes, a Greek advisor had to explain that this was the Spartan custom before they prepared to fight and die. The long hair was a symbol of a man's status as a free warrior, and the act of combing it was a calm, ritualized preparation for the deadly business to come, a sign of their supreme confidence and their readiness to face death. Their most iconic garment was the phoenicus, a cloak of a deep, brilliant crimson or scarlet red. This red cloak was not worn in battle itself, as it would have been too cumbersome, but it was worn on the march and in camp, and it was the uniform that identified them as Spartans. The color was a practical choice, as Plutarch notes that the red color would help to conceal the sight of their own blood from the enemy, and, perhaps more importantly, from their own comrades, thus preventing a loss of morale. But it was also a powerful symbol. The stark, uniform red of the Spartan army on the march would have been a terrifying and unforgettable sight, a wave of blood-red color that signaled the arrival of the most feared soldiers in Greece. The core of the Spartan warrior's equipment, and the key to his effectiveness, was his panoply as a hoplite. The term hoplite comes from the Greek word hoplon, which refers to the large, circular shield that was a hoplite's most important piece of equipment. The Spartan shield, or aspis, was a large, heavy, concave shield about 3 feet in diameter, made of wood and covered with a thin layer of bronze. It was held by a central armband, the porpax, through which the soldier would pass his left arm up to the elbow, and a grip on the rim, the antelobe, which he would hold with his hand. This design meant that the shield protected not only its bearer, but also, crucially, the right-hand side of the man standing to his left. This was a fundamental principle of the phalanx. Every man's safety depended on the discipline and courage of the man standing next to him. To drop the shield was the ultimate act of cowardice, because it not only exposed the individual, but broke the integrity of the entire shield wall, endangering everyone in the line. This is why the command of the Spartan mother, "Come back with your shield or on it," was so powerful. The front of the Spartan shield was famously decorated with a single stark letter, the capital lambda, which stood for their homeland, Lacedaemon. This simple, uniform device was another expression of their collective identity, a contrast to the individualistic and often elaborate shield designs of other Greek hoplites. The Spartan did not fight for his own personal glory. He fought for Sparta. For protection, the hoplite wore a bronze helmet, a breastplate, and greaves. The classic Spartan helmet, particularly in the later period, was the pilo-style helmet, a simple, conical bronze cap that offered good protection without obscuring vision or hearing, which was vital for hearing commands in the heat of battle. The breastplate, or cuirass, could be a sculpted bell cuirass of solid bronze, or a more flexible linothorax made of layers of linen glued together to form a tough, light, and surprisingly effective form of armor. Bronze greaves protected his shins from attack. The Spartan's primary offensive weapon was the dory, a long-thrusting spear, typically about 7 to 9 feet in length. It was made of a shaft of strong ash or cornel wood, with a flat, leaf-shaped iron spearhead at one end and a bronze butt spike, called a sorator or lizard killer, at the other. The butt spike could be used to finish off fallen enemies, or as a secondary weapon if the main spearhead broke. The spear was not a throwing weapon. It was a thrusting weapon, used overhand to stab at the enemy's face, neck, and chest over the top of the shield wall. For close-quarters combat, if the spear was broken or lost, the Spartan carried a short sword, the xiphos. This was a double-edged, straight-bladed sword, about 2 feet long, designed for hacking and thrusting in the brutal, claustrophobic crush of the melee. The Spartans were famous for their preference for this short sword, with the famous saying that it was because they liked to get one step closer to the enemy. All of this equipment was incredibly heavy, with a total panoply weighing upwards of 50 to 70 pounds. To fight effectively in this armor required immense physical strength and endurance, which the lifetime of training in the Agoge was designed to provide. But the real strength of the Spartan army lay not in its individual soldiers, but in their absolute mastery of the phalanx formation. The phalanx was a dense block of heavily armed infantry, typically 8 ranks deep. The men in the front ranks would lock their shields together, creating a solid, overlapping wall of bronze. From behind this shield wall, the spears of the first 2 or 3 ranks would project, creating a deadly hedge of iron points. The phalanx was an unstoppable offensive weapon on flat ground. It would advance slowly and deliberately, often, too. The rhythmic sound of pipes and flutes, which helped the men to keep their step and their composure. The advance of a Spartan phalanx, silent, disciplined, and inexorable, was said to be one of the most terrifying sights in all of warfare. The battle would be decided in the athismos, or the push, the moment when the 2 opposing phalanxes crashed into each other. This was a brutal and terrifying experience, a violent scrum of shields, spears, and bodies, where men would stab, shove, and trample each other to death. The victory would go to the side that could hold its formation, maintain its discipline, and push the hardest. This was where the Spartans excelled. Their entire life had been a preparation for this moment. They were trained to be a single, cohesive unit, to trust the man next to them implicitly, and to stand their ground no matter what. The Spartan phalanx was not a collection of individual heroes seeking personal glory, like the warriors of the Homeric epics. It was an anonymous, disciplined, and professional killing machine. The Spartan hoplite was the ultimate team player, a man who had been systematically stripped of his individuality and forged into a perfect instrument of the collective will. His long hair, his red cloak, and his lambda-emblazoned shield were not just the trappings of a warrior. They were the tomb, sacred uniform of a man who had completely submerged his own identity into the greater whole of the Spartan state. The image of Sparta that has come down to us is one of the most powerful and enduring in all of Western history. It is a stark and compelling vision of a society of perfect soldiers, of selfless citizen warriors who embodied the virtues of discipline, courage, and unwavering patriotism. This is the Sparta of the 300 at Thermopylae, the Sparta of the laconic quip, the Sparta of the mother who tells her son to come back either with his shield or on it. This powerful and alluring image, however, is not a pure reflection of historical reality. It is a carefully constructed ideal, a mix of propaganda, philosophical admiration, and romantic exaggeration that modern scholars have come to call the Spartan Mirage. The real Sparta was a far more complex, far more troubled, and in many ways a far less admirable society than the legend suggests. To truly understand the Spartan way, we must look beyond the gleaming bronze of the Mirage and confront the darker, more contradictory realities of this unique and brutal civilization. The primary creators of the Spartan Mirage were not the Spartans themselves. The Spartans were famously laconic and notoriously secretive. They wrote no histories, no philosophical treatises, and no detailed accounts of their own society. They were a closed book. The image we have of Sparta was constructed almost entirely by outsiders, particularly by Athenian writers and philosophers of the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, men like Xenophon, Plato, and, to a lesser extent, Aristotle, looked at Sparta from the perspective of their own turbulent, often chaotic, democratic city of Athens. In Sparta, they saw an alternative, a society that seemed to have solved the problems of political instability and internal strife that plagued the rest of the Greek world. For these thinkers, Sparta was a powerful and tempting political ideal. They admired its stability, its discipline, its apparent rejection of luxury, and its complete subordination of the individual to the collective good. Xenophon, an Athenian general who had served alongside Spartan forces, wrote a treatise called the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, in which he lavished praise on the laws of the mythical Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus. He celebrated the Agoge, the common messes, and the entire state-controlled system as a perfect machine for producing virtuous and effective citizens. Plato, in his great work, The Republic, used Sparta as a partial model for his own vision of an ideal state, a society ruled by a guardian class that lives a communal, ascetic life, free from the corrupting influence of private property and family ties. For these philosophers, Sparta was not just a real place, but a powerful idea, a potent symbol of order and discipline in a disordered world. This philosophical admiration is the foundation upon which the Spartan Mirage was built. This idealized view, however, conveniently ignored or downplayed the brutal realities that made the Spartan system possible. The first and most glaring omission is the foundation of fear upon which the entire state was built, the Helots. The Athenian admirers of Sparta rarely dwelled on the fact that this perfect society of warrior peers was only made possible by the brutal and systematic oppression of a vast enslaved population. They did not write about the Cryptia, the secret police who murdered Helots in the night, or the annual declaration of war that made any Spartan a potential killer. The idealized vision of Spartan equality and virtue was a vision that only applied to the tiny, privileged minority of Spartiate citizens. For the vast majority of the people who lived in Lacedaemonia, the Helots, Sparta was not a utopian ideal, but a totalitarian nightmare. The Mirage also promoted an image of absolute equality among the Spartan peers, the homoioi. The institution of the Syssition, with its common meals and its fixed contributions, was designed to create a sense of absolute uniformity. But the reality was very different. Even within the elite Spartiate class, there were significant disparities in wealth and status. While all Spartiates were granted a plot of land, a kleros, these plots were not of equal size or quality. Over time, through inheritance, marriage, and debt, land became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy and powerful families. Aristotle, in his Politics, harshly criticized Sparta for this very reason. He noted that the laws concerning inheritance, which allowed women to inherit and to hold large dowries, had led to a situation where a huge portion of the land was controlled by a small number of women. This concentration of wealth created a growing class of impoverished Spartiates who were unable to pay their mess dues. These men would lose their citizenship, becoming hypomeons or inferiors. The ideal of a society of equals was a fiction. By the 4th century BCE, Spartan society was a deeply unequal oligarchy, with a tiny, super-rich elite and a growing number of disenfranchised ex-citizens. The Mirage also celebrated the Spartans as the ultimate incorruptible warriors, immune to the temptations of wealth and luxury. The laws of Lycurgus were said to have banned the use of gold and silver coinage, replacing it with a deliberately clumsy and worthless iron currency to discourage the accumulation of wealth. But this too was a fiction that papered over a more complex reality. While the ideal of austerity was powerful, The Spartan elite were, in fact, deeply materialistic. Their tombs have been found to contain luxury goods, and they were famous for breeding and raising expensive horses for the chariot races at the Olympic Games. More importantly, when Spartan generals and governors were sent abroad, they often proved to be spectacularly susceptible to bribery and corruption. The General Pausanias, the victor of the great battle of Plataea against the Persians, became so corrupted by Eastern luxury and power that he was eventually recalled and starved to death in a temple as a traitor. Gylippus, the general who saved Syracuse from the Athenians, was later exiled for embezzling a huge sum of money. The harsh austerity of life at home seems to have made the Spartans particularly vulnerable to the temptations of the wider world when they were removed from the rigid social controls of their city. The image of the Spartan as the perfect, invincible soldier also needs to be qualified. While the Spartan phalanx was undoubtedly the most formidable heavy infantry force in Greece for several centuries, their military prowess was highly specialized. They were masters of the set-piece hoplite battle on a flat plain, but in other forms of warfare they were often inflexible and surprisingly incompetent. They were notoriously poor at siege warfare, rarely managing to take a walled city by assault. They were also famously inept at naval warfare, a critical weakness in the wider Greek world. Their military conservatism and their unwillingness to adapt to new tactics would eventually lead to their downfall. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Theban general Epaminondas used a revolutionary new tactic, concentrating his forces on one wing of the phalanx and attacking the Spartan line at an oblique angle. The supposedly invincible Spartan phalanx shattered, and their king was killed. The Battle of Leuctra was a catastrophic defeat that destroyed the myth of Spartan invincibility forever. Even the core of the Mirage, the idea of the fearless Spartan warrior who preferred death to dishonor, was not always the reality. While the story of the 300 at Thermopylae is a powerful testament to Spartan courage, there were also notable instances of Spartan cowardice and surrender. After a small Spartan force was cut off and surrounded by the Athenians at the island of Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, they did the unthinkable. They surrendered. The capture of 120 Spartan hoplites sent a shockwave through the Greek world. It proved that Spartans were not superhuman. They were mortals who, when faced with a hopeless situation, would choose to live. The men who surrendered, the Tresantes or Tremblers, were treated with contempt and stripped of their citizenship when they eventually returned to Sparta. But the fact that they had surrendered at all was a crack in the perfect facade of the Mirage. The Spartan Mirage was a powerful and useful legend, both for the Spartans themselves and for the other Greeks who observed them. For the Spartans, it was a form of propaganda, an ideological shield that projected an image of perfect unity and unbeatable strength, which helped to intimidate their enemies, and most importantly, their Helot population. For the rest of Greece, Sparta was a blank canvas onto which they could project their own hopes and fears about politics, discipline, and social order. The Mirage, therefore, tells us as much about the anxieties of Athens as it does about the realities of Sparta. The real Sparta was not a perfect society of equals, but a deeply flawed, rigid, and oppressive oligarchy. It was a state that was built on a foundation of terror, that was crippled by economic inequality, and that was ultimately unable to adapt to a changing world. But the power of its legend, the Spartan Mirage, would long outlive the state that created it, continuing to inspire and to caution future generations for millennia to come. For centuries, the Spartan phalanx had been the most feared and respected military force in the Greek world. Its reputation for discipline, courage, and sheer invincibility had been forged in countless battles, from the heroic sacrifice at Thermopylae to the decisive victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War in the early 4th century BCE. After the defeat of its great rival, Athens, Sparta stood as the undisputed master of Greece, the great hegemonic power that imposed its will on the other city-states. But this Spartan hegemony was a brutal and unpopular one, and it would prove to be remarkably short-lived. The very qualities that had made the Spartans so successful in war, their rigidity, their conservatism, and their contempt for outsiders, made them poor and arrogant leaders in peace. Their reign was a period of oppression that bred deep resentment among their new subject allies. This resentment would eventually coalesce around a new and rising power in central Greece, the city-state of Thebes. In the year 371 BCE, on a dusty plain in Boeotia, a single catastrophic battle would bring the entire Spartan system crashing down. The Battle of Leuctra was the final decisive battle that shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility, broke the back of their military power, and ended their brief and brutal reign as the masters of Greece forever. The city of Thebes, the leading city of the region of Boeotia, had long been a significant second-tier power in the Greek world. The Thebans had been reluctant allies of the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War, but in the years after the war, they grew increasingly resentful of Spartan arrogance and interference. In 382 BCE, a Spartan commander had treacherously seized Agoge, the citadel of Thebes, and installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy. A few years later, a group of Theban exiles, led by the charismatic and brilliant politician Pelopidas, infiltrated the city in disguise and, in a daring nighttime coup, assassinated the pro-Spartan leaders and liberated their city. This act of defiance was a direct challenge to Spartan authority, and it set the two cities on a collision course for war. The Thebans knew that to face the Spartans in a conventional battle was suicide. The Spartan phalanx, man for man, was still the finest heavy infantry in the world. To defeat them, the Thebans would need a new kind of army and a new kind of general. They found that general in a man named Epaminondas, a close friend of Pelopidas, and one of the most brilliant and innovative military thinkers in all of ancient history. Epaminondas was a student of philosophy and military theory, and he understood that the key to defeating Sparta was not to try and match their quality, but to change the rules of the game. He and Pelopidas completely reorganized the Theban army, instilling in it a new sense of professionalism and patriotic fervor. The centerpiece of this new Theban army was a unique and elite fighting force known as the Sacred Band of Thebes. This was a small, hand-picked unit of 300 men, composed of 150 pairs of male lovers. The idea was that men who were bound by a deep and intimate personal bond would fight with a more desperate and fanatical courage to protect their partner than they would for the state alone. The Sacred Band was the professional full-time corps. Of the Theban army, its elite spearhead, and it was commanded by the fearless Pelopidas. Epaminondas also fundamentally rethought the tactics of hoplite warfare. For centuries, the standard hoplite battle had been a rigid and straightforward affair. Two phalanxes of a uniform depth would advance and crash into each other head-on. The right wing of each army was traditionally the position of honor and the strongest point, as it was the only side of a man not covered by his shield. Battles were often a grinding, attritional struggle, a great push to see which side would break first. Epaminondas realized that this was a game the Thebans could never win against the superior discipline of the Spartans. So he devised a revolutionary new tactic, the oblique order of battle and the concentration of force at a single, decisive point. The final showdown came in 371 BCE. A Spartan army, led by their king, Cleombrotus, had invaded Boeotia to punish the Thebans once and for all. The two armies met on the plain of Leuctra. The Spartan army was a formidable force, numbering around 10,000 hoplites, including 700 of the elite Spartiate citizens, the true professionals. The Theban army, under the command of Epaminondas, was smaller, with only about 6,000 hoplites. According to the traditional rules of engagement, the Spartans should have been confident of an easy victory. The Spartans drew up their army in the traditional manner. Their phalanx was of a uniform depth, probably 12 ranks deep. As was their custom, their best troops, the elite Spartiate hoplites, led by King Cleombrotus himself, were placed on the position of honor, the right wing. Epaminondas, seeing this, did something completely unexpected and brilliant. Instead of distributing his forces evenly, he radically unbalanced his own line. He drew up his right wing, which was facing the Spartans' Peloponnesian allies, very thin with only a few ranks. He instructed these troops to advance slowly and to avoid a decisive engagement. Their job was simply to hold the line. All his best troops, including the elite sacred band, he massed on his left wing, directly opposite the Spartan king and his elite guard. He made this wing incredibly deep, a massive 50-rank deep column of men. His plan was to refuse his right wing and to concentrate all his power on his left, creating an overwhelming local superiority of force at the decisive point. He would not try to win the battle everywhere. He would win it at a single point by crushing the Spartan right wing and killing their king. He then advanced his army not straight on, but in an oblique or echeloned formation, with his powerful left wing advancing much faster than his weak right wing. The Spartans, seeing the Theban right holding back, were likely confused. As the two armies closed, the massive Theban left wing, with the 300-man sacred band at its very tip, smashed into the much thinner 12-deep line of the Spartans. The sheer weight of the 50-deep Theban column was immense. The Spartan front ranks, for all their courage and skill, were simply overwhelmed by the incredible physical pressure and the sheer mass of men behind them. The Spartan line, which had never been known to break, buckled and then shattered. In the brutal, close-quarters fighting that followed, the sacred band fought with a desperate fury, and they achieved the unthinkable. They cut their way through to the Spartan king, Cleombrotus, and killed him. The death of the king was a shattering blow to Spartan morale. With their king dead and their elite right wing broken and in full retreat, The rest of the Spartan army lost heart and fled the field. The battle was over. It was a stunning and decisive victory for Thebes. The Spartans had suffered a catastrophic defeat. Of the 700 elite Spartiates who had entered the battle, over 400 were killed, including their king. This was a devastating, irreplaceable loss of manpower for a state whose citizen body was already dangerously small. The Battle of Leuctra was a true watershed moment in Greek history. It was a military revolution that completely changed the face of warfare, and it was a political earthquake that shattered the Spartan hegemony forever. The news of the Spartan defeat sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. The myth of their invincibility was broken. In the aftermath of the battle, Epaminondas did not rest on his laurels. He followed up his victory with a series of brilliant campaigns that were designed to permanently cripple the foundations of Spartan power. He marched his army deep into the Peloponnese, and in his most audacious move he invaded Messenia itself, the heartland of the Helots. Here, he did something that the Spartans had dreaded for 300 years. He officially liberated the Helots and helped them to found their own new, heavily fortified capital city, Messene, on the slopes of Mount at home. This was the final, fatal blow to Sparta. The liberation of Messenia deprived the Spartans of more than half of their agricultural land and the vast majority of their Helot workforce. The economic foundation of the entire Spartan system was destroyed overnight. Without the surplus produced by the Helots of Messenia, the Spartan citizens could no longer afford to be a full-time military class. Their unique way of life, which had been built entirely on the brutal exploitation of the Messenians, was no longer sustainable. Sparta was reduced, almost overnight, from the great hegemonic power of Greece to a second-rate regional state, locked in a perpetual and bitter border war with their newly freed and vengeful Messenian neighbors. They would never again be a major player in Greek politics. The final battle on the plain of Leuctra had not just defeated a Spartan army, it had destroyed a civilization. Epaminondas, with his military genius, had exposed the fatal weaknesses that lay behind the Spartan Mirage, and in a single bloody afternoon he had brought the long and brutal history of Spartan dominance to a final and definitive end. The catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC was a wound from which Sparta would never recover. It was more than just a military loss. It was a systemic collapse. The shattering of their army and the subsequent liberation of the Helots of Messenia by the Theban general Epaminondas destroyed both the myth of their invincibility and the economic foundation of their unique way of life. The centuries that followed were a long and painful period of decline, a slow slide into irrelevance and obscurity. The once great power of Greece was reduced to a minor provincial state, struggling to adapt to a world that it no longer understood and that no longer feared it. This long twilight would see Sparta attempt a series of radical and ultimately failed reforms, before finally being swallowed up by the new, rising superpower of the Mediterranean, Rome. The final chapter of Spartan history is a poignant story of a society trapped by its own glorious past, unable to escape the rigid traditions that had once made it great, but which now ensured its inevitable decline. The immediate aftermath of Leuctra was a desperate struggle for survival. The Thebans, under Epaminondas, had marched deep into Spartan territory, a humiliation the Spartans had not suffered in centuries. While they were unable to take the city of Sparta itself, the psychological blow was immense. But the most devastating consequence was the permanent loss of Messenia. This rich and fertile land had been the jewel in Sparta's crown, the source of the agricultural wealth that had allowed the Spartiate class to dedicate their entire lives to warfare. Without the surplus produced by the Messenian Helots, the entire Spartan system began to crumble. Many Spartan citizens no longer had the income to pay their mess dues for the Syssition. This meant they were stripped of their citizenship, becoming hypomeons or inferiors. This led to a catastrophic acceleration of a problem that was already crippling the Spartan state: oliganthropy, or the shortage of citizens. The number of full Spartan citizens, the homoioi, which had been around 8,000 in the time of the Persian Wars, had dwindled to less than 1,500 by the time of Leuctra. The losses from the battle, combined with the economic ruin that followed, reduced this number even further. Sparta simply no longer had the manpower to field a significant army. Faced with this existential crisis, Sparta turned inward. The 4th and 3rd centuries BCE were a period of intense internal political turmoil and debate. The state was deeply divided between a small, super-rich land-owning elite who resisted any change and a growing number of impoverished and disenfranchised ex-citizens who desperately wanted reform. In the mid-3rd century, 2 remarkable Spartan kings, Aegeus IV and Cleomenes III, attempted to stage a social and political revolution to restore Sparta to its former glory. They were radical reformers who sought to turn back the clock and to reinstate the mythical constitution of Lycurgus in its purest form. Aegeus IV, who came to the throne in 244 BCE, was a young and idealistic king who was horrified by the extreme inequality and the decline of the traditional Spartan discipline. He proposed a radical program of reform, the cancellation of all debts and a massive redistribution of the land to create 4,500 new, equal plots for both existing Spartiates and selected outsiders, which would dramatically increase the citizen body. This bold plan was, of course, fiercely opposed by the wealthy elite, including his co-king Leonidas. In a dramatic power struggle, Aegeus was eventually betrayed, captured, and, in an unprecedented act of sacrilege, he and his mother and grandmother were executed by the ephors. His revolution had failed. 2 decades later, the revolution was revived by the other king, Cleomenes III, a far more ruthless and effective ruler than Aegeus. Learning from Aegeus's failure, Cleomenes launched his reforms through a bloody coup. He hired mercenaries, had the ephors assassinated, and exiled 80 of the wealthiest citizens. With his power now absolute, he enacted a radical program similar to that of Aegeus. He canceled debts, he redistributed the land, and he created thousands of new citizens, including, for the first time, some Helots who were granted their freedom in exchange for military service. He also reinstated the old, brutal form of the Agoge and the common messes. For a brief period it seemed as if the revolution had succeeded. Cleomenes, at the head of a newly revitalized Spartan army, reconquered much of the Peloponnese and seemed poised to restore Sparta as a major Greek power. But his success alarmed the other major power in Greece at the time, the Achaean League, which was now allied with the rising kingdom of Macedon. In 222 BCE, at the Battle of Silesia, The combined armies of the Achaeans and the Macedonians crushed the new Spartan army. Cleomenes was forced to flee to Egypt, and his revolution collapsed. The old oligarchy was restored, and Sparta was forced to join the Achaean League, its independence now severely curtailed. The dream of a Spartan Renaissance was over. The reforms had failed because they were an attempt to turn back the clock, to impose an archaic and idealized vision of the past on a world that had fundamentally changed. Sparta was now a minor player in a much larger game, a game that was increasingly being dominated by a new and powerful force from the West. The Roman Republic, having conquered Italy and defeated Carthage, was now expanding its influence into the Greek world. The Greek states, caught up in their endless internal squabbles, were no match for the overwhelming power of the Roman legions. In the 2nd century BCE, Rome systematically defeated Macedon and the Achaean League, and by 146 BCE, all of Greece had effectively become a Roman province. Sparta's final years as an independent state were a sad and pathetic postscript. Under a tyrant named Nabis, the city experienced a brief and brutal resurgence, based on the forced liberation of Helots and the creation of a pirate fleet. But Nabis was soon defeated by the Romans. For the most part, the Spartans, with their formidable military reputation, were treated with a degree of respect and leniency by their new Roman masters. The Romans, who greatly admired the Spartan Mirage, saw Sparta as a kind of living museum, a quaint and anachronistic relic of a more virtuous, heroic age. Under Roman rule, Sparta was transformed into a tourist destination. Wealthy Romans would travel to the city to witness the famous and now theatrical brutality of the Agoge, the ritual flogging of the boys at the altar of Artemis Orthia, which had once been a secret and solemn rite of passage, was turned into a bloody public spectacle, with a special amphitheater-like structure built so that tourists could have a better view. The Spartans, no longer the masters of Greece, were now reduced to performing a parody of their own ancient traditions for the entertainment of their conquerors. They were the living embodiment of their own mirage, their city a kind of ancient theme park of discipline and endurance. For the next few centuries, Sparta survived as a moderately prosperous but politically insignificant provincial town within the vast peace of the Roman Empire. But the city suffered greatly during the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was sacked by the Heruli in 267 CE and again by the Visigoths under Alaric in 396 CE. The final blow came with the Slavic invasions of the late 6th century, which led to the abandonment and destruction of the ancient site. For centuries, the city of Lycurgus lay in ruins, its memory preserved only in the texts of the Greek and Roman writers who had so admired and misunderstood it. The rediscovery of Sparta in the modern era has been a process of peeling back the layers of its own powerful legend. The long decline and fall of Sparta is a powerful cautionary tale. It is the story of a society that was so perfectly adapted to a specific set of historical circumstances that it was unable to change when those circumstances changed. Their rigid and conservative nature, which had been the source of their strength, became the source of their fatal weakness. They were a people who chose to look forever backwards, to a mythical golden age, and in doing so, they rendered themselves incapable of adapting to the future. The long Spartan twilight was the inevitable result of a society that had chosen to sacrifice everything art, freedom, and ultimately its own survival for the sake of preserving a brutal and unsustainable perfection. The physical power of Sparta died on the battlefields of Leuctra and Silesia, and its political independence was finally extinguished by the legions of Rome. But the idea of Sparta, the powerful and enduring legend of a perfect warrior society, was only just beginning its long and influential journey through the imagination of Western civilization. The real Sparta was a complex, brutal, and ultimately failed state. But the legend of Sparta proved to be one of the most successful and resilient cultural exports in all of history. This powerful and alluring image, a mix of historical fact, philosophical idealization, and romantic exaggeration, is what modern scholars call the Spartan Mirage. It is a testament to the power of a good story, a legend that was created by Sparta's admirers and enemies, and one that would be used, abused, and reinterpreted for the next 2,000 years by philosophers, revolutionaries, and tyrants alike. The enduring legacy of Sparta is not found in the ruins of its city, but in the indestructible fortress of its myth. The primary architects of the Spartan Mirage were the Romans. As the Romans conquered the Greek world, they developed a deep and highly complex relationship with Greek culture. They were the conquerors, but they were also the pupils, and they looked upon the great achievements of the Greeks with a mixture of admiration and a sense of their own cultural inferiority. In Sparta, they found a Greek state that seemed to resonate with their own most cherished, if often idealized, traditional values. The Romans of the late Republic and early Empire looked back nostalgically to their own early history, to an age when they imagined their ancestors to be simple, tough farmer-soldiers, men of piety, discipline, and unwavering devotion to the state. This was the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. In the stories they heard about Sparta, they saw a perfect, living embodiment of these very virtues. They saw in Lycurgus a lawgiver to rival their own, in Leonidas a hero of selfless sacrifice, and in the Agoge a system of education that put their own perceived moral decay to shame. The Roman writer Plutarch, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, became the single most important transmitter of the Spartan Mirage to the later world. His parallel lives, a series of biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, included A Life of Lycurgus, the mythical Spartan lawgiver. This work is not a history in the modern sense. It is a moral biography, a portrait of an ideal statesman and an ideal state. Plutarch, drawing on a long tradition of pro-Spartan philosophical writing, presents a glowing and largely uncritical account of the Spartan system. He celebrates the abolition of wealth, the common messes, the brutal education of the Agoge, and the high status of Spartan women, presenting them all as the brilliant creations of a single, wise founder. He includes a vast collection of sayings of the Spartans and sayings of Spartan women, short, pithy anecdotes that perfectly encapsulate the Spartan ideals of courage, brevity, and absolute patriotism. It is from Plutarch that we get many of the most famous stories: the boy with the fox, the mother with the shield, and the defiant responses of the Spartans to the Persians. Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus was immensely popular, and it became the primary lens through which all subsequent generations would view Sparta a lens that magnified its virtues and largely ignored its brutal realities, such as the oppression of the Helots. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the story of Sparta, along with the rest of classical literature, was largely preserved in the monasteries of the Byzantine Empire and the libraries of the Islamic world. It was during the Renaissance, with the rediscovery of classical texts, that the Spartan Mirage was reborn in Western Europe. The political thinkers of the Renaissance, grappling with the question of how to create a stable and successful state, looked to the classical world for models. While many admired the democratic ideal of Athens, others were more drawn to the discipline, stability, and military prowess of Sparta. Niccolò Machiavelli, in his Discourses on Livy, praised Sparta as a perfect example of a mixed constitution, a blend of monarchy, the two kings, aristocracy, the Senate or Gerousia, and democracy, the assembly of the people, which he saw as the most stable and enduring form of government. That this admiration for the Spartan model grew even stronger during the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in works like The Social Contract, celebrated Sparta as the ultimate example of a state where the individual had been successfully subsumed into the general will of the community. He saw the Spartans as a free people because they had willingly sacrificed their selfish, individual desires for the sake of the collective good of the fatherland. For Rousseau, the Agoge was a model of public education, a system designed to create patriotic citizens rather than private individuals. This idealized vision of Sparta as a selfless, egalitarian, and virtuous republic became a powerful inspiration for the revolutionaries in both America and France. The founding fathers of the United States, in designing their own constitution, were deeply influenced by the classical ideal of the mixed constitution, in which Sparta was a prime example. However, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Spartan Mirage began to take on a much darker and more sinister hue. As the ideologies of nationalism, authoritarianism, and racial purity began to rise in Europe, Sparta was co-opted as a powerful historical precedent. The focus shifted from Sparta as a model republic to Sparta as a model military state. The Prussian military state of the 19th century, with its emphasis on discipline, obedience, and a powerful military aristocracy, was often compared to ancient Sparta. The most horrific and explicit appropriation of the Spartan ideal was by the Nazi regime in Germany. The Nazi leaders, particularly Adolf Hitler, were obsessed with an idealized and deeply racist vision of the classical world. They saw the ancient Greeks, and particularly the Spartans, as their pure Aryan ancestors. They admired and sought to emulate every aspect of the Spartan system. They praised Spartan eugenics, the practice of inspecting infants and exposing the weak, as a model for their own horrific policies of racial hygiene and euthanasia. They saw the Agoge as the perfect model for the Hitler Youth, a system for indoctrinating the young and turning them into fanatical, obedient servants of the state. They glorified the Spartan subordination of the individual to the collective, and they celebrated the heroic death of the 300 at Thermopylae as the ultimate expression of the warrior's duty to sacrifice himself for the nation. In a speech to officer cadets in 1944, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, explicitly cited the Spartan killing of the Helots as a precedent for the Holocaust. For the Nazis, the darkest and most brutal aspects of Spartan society were not a source of shame, but their greatest attraction. This dark chapter and its reception serves as a powerful warning about the dangers of idealizing a society built on racial supremacy and ruthless violence. In the post-war world, the Spartan Mirage has continued to thrive, particularly in popular culture. The story of the Battle of Thermopylae, most famously depicted in the graphic novel 300, and its subsequent film adaptation, has cemented the image of the Spartans as the ultimate heroes, the selfless defenders of freedom against the overwhelming forces of tyranny. While a powerful and visually stunning piece of storytelling, this depiction is, of course, a highly romanticized and simplified version of history. It presents the Spartans as champions of liberty while completely ignoring the fact that their own society was a brutal slave state. The Spartan ideal also lives on in the language of military training, sports coaching, and even corporate management. The word Spartan itself has become a synonym for a life of austerity, discipline, and toughness. Elite military units around the world still look to the Agoge as a model for creating unbreakable bonds and pushing soldiers to the limits of their endurance. The Spartan Mirage remains a powerful and seductive one because it speaks to a deep-seated desire for order, for discipline, and for a sense of belonging to something greater than oneself. But the real history of Sparta is a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that the pursuit of a perfect, ordered state can come at a terrible human cost, and that the very virtues we admire, courage, discipline, and self-sacrifice, can also be the tools of a brutal and unforgiving system of oppression. The enduring legend of Sparta is a powerful mirror in which we can see our own conflicting ideals reflected. For centuries, the story of Sparta was a story told only by others, a narrative woven from the texts of Athenian philosophers, Roman biographers, and the awe-struck accounts of ancient historians. Sparta itself was a silent character in its own drama. Unlike Athens, with its magnificent and enduring Parthenon, or Rome, with its colossal Colosseum, ancient Sparta left behind no grand, impressive ruins. The city that had dominated Greece with its military might for centuries simply seemed to vanish, leaving behind a landscape of olive groves and a small provincial town. The great Athenian historian Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BCE, when Sparta was at the height of its power, made a remarkably prescient observation. He noted that if the city of Sparta were to be deserted, future generations, looking at its simple temples and the foundations of its buildings, would find it hard to believe that its power had been as great as its reputation. This prediction proved to be uncannily accurate. For centuries, the physical reality of Sparta was an enigma. Its meager remains a poor testament to its legendary power. The modern quest to uncover the real physical Sparta through archaeology has been a long, patient, and often frustrating process, a search that has revealed not a city of monumental grandeur, but a world of fascinating contradictions that both challenges and enriches our understanding of the Spartan way. The long silence that followed the city's final decline was not broken until the 19th century, with the birth of modern Greece and a renewed European interest in the classical past. Early travelers and archaeologists who came to the Eurotas Valley in search of the legendary city of Lycurgus were often deeply disappointed. They found no great walls, no magnificent public buildings, nothing to rival the splendors of Athens or Corinth. The Spartans, true to their austere ethos, had built for function, not for show. They had lived in simple houses, and their public buildings were modest. Their true defensive wall, as they famously boasted, was the chests of their citizens. The first systematic archaeological excavations at Sparta were begun in the early 20th century by the British School at Athens. The main focus of their work was the site that was believed to be the ancient Acropolis and the sanctuary of Athena Chalkiokos, or Athena of the Bronze House. While they found the remains of the sanctuary, it was not the monumental temple they had hoped for. Far more significant were their discoveries at a different, less promising-looking site on the banks of the Eurotas River, the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. The sanctuary of Artemis Orthia proved to be an archaeological treasure trove, one of the most important sites for understanding the deep, archaic roots of Spartan culture. This was the site of the infamous ritual whipping of the Spartan youths. The British excavators uncovered the altar where this bloody rite took place, as well as the foundations of the Roman-era theater that was later built to accommodate the tourists who came to watch the spectacle. But the most important finds were the thousands upon thousands of votive offerings that had been dedicated to the goddess over a period of nearly 1,000 years. These offerings were a stunning revelation. They included a vast number of small lead figurines, depicting everything from soldiers and animals to grotesque masks. There were also beautifully carved ivory plaques and combs, objects of exquisite artistry that showed a strong influence from the Near East. These finds completely contradicted the traditional image of the Spartans as a people who had no interest in art or luxury. It revealed that in the early archaic period, before the full implementation of the Lycurgan system, Sparta had been a vibrant artistic center, as sophisticated and as connected to the wider Mediterranean world as any other Greek city. The excavations also provided a glimpse into the darker side of Spartan ritual. The grotesque masks, with their distorted and terrifying features, were likely used in ritual dances, perhaps as part of an initiation ceremony designed to ward off evil and to harden the young boys to fear. The sheer number of these offerings and the long span of time over which they were dedicated showed that this was one of the most ancient and most important religious sites in all of Sparta. Another key area of excavation was the Spartan theater. The discovery of a large, well-built stone theater from the Hellenistic and Roman periods was another puzzle. A city that supposedly despised frivolous entertainment had, in fact, built one of the largest theaters in the Peloponnese. While the Spartans of the classical period were not known for their love of drama, the presence of the theater suggests that in their later history they embraced more common forms of Greek culture, or at least provided for the entertainment of the many non-citizen inhabitants and the Roman tourists. The search for the tombs of the legendary Spartan kings, like Leonidas, has proven to be a far more frustrating endeavor. Unlike the great Mycenaean kings with their golden treasures, the Spartan kings were buried with a degree of simplicity. The location of their tombs is still unknown. The archaeology of Sparta is an archaeology of absences. The lack of grand monuments, the scarcity of inscriptions, and the simple nature of their burials all make the job of the archaeologist incredibly difficult. Modern archaeology, however, is beginning to fill in some of these blanks. The focus has shifted from the major sanctuaries to the study of the wider landscape of Laconia and Messenia. Large-scale archaeological surveys, where teams of archaeologists walk systematically across the countryside, recording every sherd of pottery and every foundation stone, are creating a detailed map of the ancient Spartan state. This work is revealing the settlement patterns of the non-citizen population, the perioiko, and the Helots. It is beginning to give us a picture of their villages, their farms, and their own local shrines, a world that existed in the shadow of the Spartiate elite but was essential for the functioning of the state. The study of human remains is also providing new and surprising insights. The analysis of skeletons from Spartan burials can tell us about their diet, their health, and the incredible physical stress their bodies were under. It can confirm the evidence of constant, rigorous physical training from a young age. Scientific analysis of the materials used in their crafts, such as the bronze for their helmets and the clay for their pottery, can trace the trade routes that supplied their city. The archaeology of Sparta is a perfect metaphor for the civilization itself. It is difficult, austere, and does not give up its secrets easily. There is no golden death mask of Leonidas, no Parthenon of Sparta. The material record is quiet, subtle, and often contradictory. But what the archaeologists have uncovered is, in many ways, more interesting than the legend. They have revealed a culture that was more complex, more artistic in its early days, and more troubled in its later ones than the monolithic Mirage would suggest. The echoes from the valley of the Eurotas, as uncovered by the archaeologist Trau, do not give us the Sparta of the myth. They give us something far more valuable, a glimpse of the real human Sparta, a society of immense strengths and fatal, tragic flaws. The archaeology provides a crucial and necessary counterpoint to the powerful legend, grounding the Spartan enigma in the soil of its beautiful and rugged homeland. Our journey through the harsh and unforgiving world of the Spartan Way has come to an end. We have moved beyond the popular legends of the 300 and the laconic quips to confront a more complex and far more disturbing reality. We have seen a society that was utterly unique in the ancient world, a civilization that deliberately and ruthlessly engineered every aspect of its citizens' lives, from the moment of their birth to the moment of their death, for a single, all-consuming purpose: the creation of the perfect soldier and the maintenance of an unshakable state. We began with the dark secret that is the key to understanding everything about Sparta, the Helots. We saw that the Spartan state was not a republic of equals, but a military aristocracy, a small and terrified minority living as an army of occupation. In their own land, their entire way of life built upon the brutal and systematic oppression of a vast enslaved population. This foundation of fear was the engine that drove their entire social experiment. We followed the Spartan boy from the moment of his inspection by the elders through the 13 years of brutal, dehumanizing training in the Agoge, a system designed to strip him of his individuality and forge him into a tool of the state. We sat with him in the communal mess hall, the Syssition, where his character was tested daily, where he swore a silent blood oath of loyalty to his comrades, and where the disgusting black broth was a daily reminder of the Spartan rejection. Of all comfort and luxury, we have seen the unique and powerful role of Spartan women who were educated and empowered not for their own sake, but to fulfill their primary duty as the mothers of warriors, the producers of the state's most important weapon. And we have stood in the ranks of the phalanx with the Spartan Hoplite himself, the final product of this relentless system, a disciplined and fearless soldier who, with his red cloak and his lambda emblazoned shield, was the most feared infantryman in all of Greece. But we have also peeled back the layers of the Spartan Mirage, the idealized legend created by outsiders who saw in Sparta a perfect model of order and discipline. We have seen that the reality was one of profound social inequality, of political corruption, and of a military system that, for all its strengths, was rigid and ultimately unable to adapt. We witnessed the catastrophic end of their hegemony at the Battle of Leuctra, a single defeat that shattered their myth of invincibility and destroyed the economic foundations of their state. And we have followed them through their long, sad decline, a proud and stubborn people who became a living tourist attraction, a parody of their own glorious past, before finally being swallowed by the rising tide of Rome. The Spartan Way was a radical and terrifying experiment in social engineering. It was a society that willingly sacrificed everything that many other cultures hold dear: art, literature, philosophy, economic freedom, and the comforts of family life for the sake of creating a perfect and unbreachable security state. For a time it succeeded, creating the most dominant military power in Greece. But its very rigidity, its inability to change, and the profound injustice that lay at its very heart ultimately doomed it to failure. The story of Sparta remains one of the most powerful and most cautionary tales in all of history. It is a testament to the incredible things that human beings can achieve when they are bound by a common purpose, but it is also a chilling reminder of the terrible price that can be paid for the pursuit of an inhuman perfection. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free from the harsh discipline of the Spartan barracks.